Have you ever stopped to consider how much of your life once rested in the calloused hands of just one man? In an old frontier settlement, that man was the blacksmith, and he was the silent architect of every single day you lived. Every hinge holding your door, every blade in your kitchen, and every shoe on your horse came from his forge. Yet you trusted his work without a second thought, much like you trust the very ground under your feet. You never felt the need to inspect what he made, because you simply used it, and that blind reliance is exactly where the danger began. Some of those men have been quietly scrubbed from our history, and it wasn't because they were bad at the trade, or failed the people around them. They were erased because what they manufactured was wrong in a way that no county clerk knew how to file, no preacher could ever explain, and no neighbor dared to speak of once the fire went out. When a name is missing from the official records, it usually means the person didn't matter enough to write down. But sometimes that empty space is the record itself. Sometimes a collective decision was made that a name was simply safer if it was gone forever. Before we go any further into this, I want you to drop your location in the comments so I can see where you're listening from tonight. If you happen to be from the mountain counties of eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, or upper Tennessee, you might find something familiar in what comes next. It might not be the specific events of the story, but you will recognize the texture of it and the way certain hollows have a habit of keeping things they should have let go. This is the story of Harlan's Notch, eastern Kentucky, in the year 1864, concerning a blacksmith named Callum Drest, and a forge that kept running long after the fuel and the iron had both run out. Harlan's Notch never appeared on any map that mattered to the rest of the world, sitting high on a ridge between two deep hollows, with maybe 80 people total if you included the outlying farms. The settlement functioned the way all mountain communities did back then, relying on proximity and necessity rather than any formal laws or government structures. People understood they needed each other to survive the brutal winters, so they lived just close enough to help and just far enough apart to avoid causing trouble. By 1864, the war had been chewing away at that delicate arrangement for 3 long years, and the young men were mostly gone to one side or the other. A few had simply vanished into the mountains and were never mentioned again, while the iron shipments had completely stopped, and the little money that once moved through the ridge had dried up. The community was left with only what they could grow or repair themselves, and their ability to keep those tools working was narrowing with every passing month. Callum Drest had operated the forge at Harlan's Notch for 15 years, a lean man in his mid-40s, with the heavy forearms that only come from a lifetime of striking hot metal. He had shod horses for families who couldn't pay him, and quietly accepted credit he knew he would never collect, earning a reputation for clean welds and fair prices. While he wasn't the sort of person anyone sought out for a long conversation, he was the one man everyone in the settlement needed to stay exactly where he was. As the spring of 1864 arrived, his stock of raw iron was almost entirely gone, and everyone knew that no supply wagons were coming up the ridge. The community was staring down a planting season with no way to replace a broken blade or a snapped hinge, and Drest watched the desperation growing in his neighbor's eyes. The problem had a name that everyone recognized, but the solution he eventually found was something else entirely. For 3 days in late April, the forge belonging to Drest sat cold and silent. He hadn't offered an explanation to a single soul, nor had he left a word with a neighbor before vanishing into the trees. His mule was gone, and he was gone with it. But in a place like Harlan's Notch, people generally didn't press for answers. A man had every right to move through these mountains without accounting for his time, so the village simply watched the empty shop and waited. He finally returned on the third evening, with his mule loaded down so heavily that the poor animal moved with a slow, labored gait. Whatever it carried was pale, almost white, and stacked in rough chunks across the animal's back. It was wrapped loosely in canvas that didn't quite cover the load, and it was visible enough that Amos Kettrick saw the cargo clearly as Drest walked past his property. Kettrick lived right against the path Drest used, and he watched the man lead that burdened mule toward the forge without saying a word. Years later, Kettrick would describe that material in a document for a land dispute that had nothing to do with Drest and everything to do with a parcel near the ravine. His description was hauntingly specific, noting that the material was much denser than it looked at first glance. The surface had a strange, waxy quality that wasn't exactly slick, but wasn't rough either, sitting somewhere between the feel of chalk and candle tallow. When he tapped a piece of it later, it didn't crumble the way limestone does, but instead held its shape with a stubborn, unnatural strength. Drest told him he'd found the stuff in a collapsed section of a ravine wall about 4 miles to the east, just past where the second creek crosses the trail. He called it ore, though he admitted it was just a different kind than what they were used to. And then he kept walking toward his shop. Kettrick noted one other detail in those same papers that stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was the smell, which wasn't sulfur or rot or the flat mineral scent of wet stone, but something closer to chalk dust with a hidden layer underneath it. He tried to name that scent twice in his notes, but he crossed out both attempts as if the words themselves didn't fit the reality. The forge was lit within hours of Drest getting home, and he didn't seem to sleep or eat before he got the fire roaring. Kettrick could hear the work starting from his own porch, the rhythmic gasping of the bellows and the heavy strike of the hammer ringing out. On a still April night, the sound of a forge at full heat carries much farther than it should, and Drest worked through the darkness as if he were chased by something. This material didn't behave like any iron ore the locals had ever seen. Kettrick's notes don't give us the technical specifics of the smelting, but he does record that a man named Purvis Cole went to help that first night. Cole sometimes worked the bellows for Drest, but he left the shop after less than an hour because he felt a deep discomfort he couldn't quite put into words. He told Kettrick later that the material didn't flow like iron when it took the heat, but instead did something else entirely that he didn't want to stand there and watch. Drest kept working anyway, seemingly unbothered by whatever had spooked his assistant. He wasn't asking the material to act like iron, but was instead learning exactly what it was capable of doing on its own terms. By the look of what started coming out of that forge over the next few weeks, it was capable of plenty. What he'd pulled from that ravine wasn't ore in any sense the village understood, but they wouldn't realize that until the tools were already gripped tight in their hands. Over the 6 weeks that followed that first fire, Drest produced a steady run of tools, including hatchets, draw knives, and a farrier's rasp. He made 2 adzes and a set of chisels with handles he'd wrapped in cord because the material wouldn't take a socket the way iron does. He worked with a strange, constant rhythm that lacked the usual gaps and delays of a blacksmith shop. There was no long waiting for the heat to come up right, and no slow cooling or constant reworking, because whatever process he'd settled on moved much faster than traditional ironwork. The tools looked wrong from the moment they left the anvil, and that was the very first thing people noticed when they saw them. The color was a pale, grayish white, rather than the dark gray of worked iron, and the surface caught the light differently, depending on how you held it. If you run your thumb across a piece of good iron, it feels uniform and cold, but these chisels had a texture to them. There was a slight grain, almost like you were touching fine-grained wood that had been turned into stone. And while it wasn't unpleasant, it certainly wasn't right. Drest knew the neighbors would look at his work sideways, so he didn't wait for them to come to him with their questions. He brought the tools out into the light and demonstrated them on a heavy log he'd set up right outside the forge. The hatchet split the wood clean with a single strike. The chisels bit deep without slipping, and the adze moved through green wood as smooth as a razor. Whatever this white material was, it took and held a cutting edge as well as any iron, and in many cases that edge lasted far longer than anyone expected. Albert Kaus was the first man to take a set home. He was a carpenter in his 40s who had been nursing the same 3 worn-out chisels for 2 years because there was simply nothing else available to replace them. He bought 2 of Drest's chisels and an adze, and within a week he was writing to his brother about how well they performed. The tools felt strangely light in the hand, much lighter than iron of the same size should be, but they bit into the timber and didn't chatter or bounce. He told himself he'd just use them until something better came along, but for the moment they were the best he had. The tools moved through the settlement quickly after that, because Drest kept his prices low and the people were desperate for supplies. A man with a horse that needs shoeing or a roof that needs fixing doesn't have the luxury of waiting for iron that might never arrive. You took what was available on the mountain and you were grateful for it, even if the metal felt like bone and the color made you uneasy. Kos was back at his workbench within days of getting his new kit, but 2 weeks into the job he noticed something strange on his palms. There were small, pale patches of skin that were slightly raised, though they weren't the kind of blisters a working man recognizes. Blisters fill with fluid and pop and eventually scar over, and these weren't calluses either, which usually build up slowly and evenly where the handle rubs the skin. These marks were discrete and bounded, looking more like something applied to the skin from the outside rather than something growing from within his own body. He pressed on one of the spots and felt absolutely nothing. He thought the patches felt cooler than the rest of his hand, but he couldn't be entirely certain, and he didn't want to dwell on it. He kept working, even as the patches began to spread slowly toward his wrists, telling himself it was just a reaction to the cord wrapping on the handles. Kaus wasn't the only one seeing these changes, of course. He was just the first one to stop and really look at his hands. By the middle of that summer, 6 different people in Harlan's Notch were carrying those same pale patches on their skin. Every single person who showed the symptoms had spent time using the tools Drest made, and not one person who stayed away from those tools had a mark on them. It was a clean line drawn through the settlement, separating those who had touched the material from those who hadn't. Amos Kettrick was the one who started keeping the list. He wasn't a doctor or a man of science, but he was a farmer in his mid-50s who understood that memory is a treacherous thing that bends toward what you want to believe. His ledger was a plain thing, where he recorded a name, the specific tool they used, the date they first picked it up, and the day the patches finally appeared. There were 6 names and 6 tools, and every single entry on that paper was tracking in the exact same direction. What made the people of the Hollow so slow to act was the simple fact that the patches didn't actually hurt. We know this because the detail shows up in two separate places, once in Kettrick's notes, and again in a letter written by a woman named Prudy Vass to her sister over in Whitley County. Pain is usually what makes a person stop what they're doing to go looking for help, but these marks were just there, feeling slightly raised and a little cool when you pressed them. Since they didn't interfere with the daily chores, people just kept doing what they had to do to get through the season. In her letter, Prudy described her husband Len's hands as turning the same color as the material Drest had brought up from the hollow. She wrote those words plainly, the way you might describe a change in the weather that you've been watching for a long time. It was something that had stopped feeling like a crisis and started feeling like an inevitable shift in the world around her. Len's patches had first appeared on his palms back in June, and by the time she sat down to write that letter, the discoloration was already moving steadily up toward his wrists. The local farrier, a man named Galt Seri, was even further along than the others. He had been using one of Drest's rasps on horses since the beginning of June, working with it every day for 3 weeks, before he finally looked at his forearms and realized something was wrong. The patches on Seri weren't just marks anymore, because they had started to harden into something waxy and rigid. When the light hit his skin, it reflected off the surface in a way that normal skin never does, and when he pressed down on his own arm, the natural give of the muscle was gone. It wasn't completely stiff yet, but the arm didn't feel like it belonged to him anymore. There is one entry in Kettrick's notes that feels different from all the others, because it involves a child. A young boy, whose name wasn't recorded in the ledger, happened to pick up one of the chisels for less than an hour while his father was busy inspecting it. The father eventually set the tool down, and the boy carried it around the yard for a little while, the way children do, which was the only contact he ever had with the material. 4 days after that afternoon in the yard, a patch the size of a silver dollar appeared right in the center of the child's palm. That was the moment the village finally understood the reality of what they were looking at. This wasn't some slow reaction that required weeks of constant use to take hold of a person. Less than an hour of contact had been enough to change that boy, and the realization of that speed changed the way everyone looked at Drest. Through all of this, Drest continued to work with the material every single day, as he handled it and shaped it and breathed in the dust it made. His hands remained exactly as they had always been, dark from the heat of the forge and calloused from years of labor, but with no patches or hardening to be found. Everyone else who touched his work was changing, yet the man who made the tools stayed exactly the same. That final detail was the one thing Kettrick couldn't push out of his mind. The fact that Drest remained untouched while the sickness moved through everyone else meant something specific, even if Kettrick didn't have the words for it yet. Amos Kettrick began asking his questions in August of 1864. He didn't do it loudly or in a way that would make Drest suspicious, but he moved through the facts with the steady pace of a man who didn't trust anything he hadn't seen for himself. He was a 53-year-old farmer with a ledger he'd kept since 1849, a book filled with crop yields and weather patterns, and the occasional note about things that seemed worth remembering. The entries regarding Drest and the tools started out small, but by the end of August, the list of names had grown so long that the pattern couldn't be ignored. He decided to go to Drest directly before he spoke to anyone else in the settlement. That was just his way of doing things, so he walked down to the forge and waited until Drest had finally put his hammer down for the day. He asked him plainly what that material was, and where exactly in the ravine he had found it. Drest's answer was recorded in Kettrick's ledger, almost word for word, and it was as brief as it was unsettling. He told Kettrick that the tools worked, and that they held their edge, and then he said that was the only thing that actually mattered. The man didn't try to deny that he knew what the material was, and he didn't pretend to be ignorant of the situation. He simply redirected the conversation toward the one thing no one in Harlan's Notch could argue with, which was the fact that the tools were better than anything they'd ever owned. Kettrick made a specific note that Drest never blinked or looked away while he spoke, and that level of confidence felt more dangerous than if he had been caught in a lie. After that conversation ended, Kettrick went back to the forge a second time when he knew Drest wouldn't be there. A pile of the raw material was still sitting near the back wall, wrapped up in the same heavy canvas it had arrived in. Kettrick reached down and unwrapped a single piece, holding it in his hands for a long time while he studied the surface. When he wrote in his ledger that night, he didn't give the material a name, but he described it with a level of detail he hadn't used before. He wrote that the substance wasn't stone or any mineral he had ever seen, because it wasn't uniform or shaped by the usual pressures of time and earth. It had a grain to it, much like the grain you find in a piece of wood, and it all ran in one single direction. He also noted a gentle curve in one section of the piece, an arc that looked far too intentional to be a random break in a rock. He stood there in the quiet of the forge and felt the strange weight of it before he finally set it back down and covered it with the canvas. 2 days later, Kettrick rode out to a settlement called Redbird Crossing to find a man named Hiram Coles. Coles had arrived in the mountains after the first year of the war, a former army surgeon who had spent years working on broken bodies under the worst conditions imaginable. He was a man with a certain kind of steadiness that Kettrick knew he could trust with a secret this heavy. Kettrick placed a fragment of the material on the table and explained exactly where it came from and what it was doing to the people back home. Coles picked the piece up and turned it over in his hands, holding it close to the light from the window while he went quiet. That silence told Kettrick everything he needed to know before the doctor even opened his mouth. Coles didn't bother writing anything down in a ledger. What he said out loud to Kettrick in that room was more than enough to change everything. Bone, he said. Dense cortical bone. The hard outer layer of a large bone. Not the spongy interior material. Not the soft tissue that breaks down first. The kind that survives. The grain Kettrick had noticed, and spent 2 entries trying to describe, wasn't a geological feature. It was osteon structure, the microscopic channels that run through compact bone in a consistent direction, carrying blood when the bone was living, leaving that faint parallel texture behind after it wasn't. You can't fake that pattern. Stone doesn't produce it. Mineral deposits don't produce it. Only bone does, and only bone from something that had once been large enough to generate that density. Coles said he couldn't make a species determination from a fragment that size. The mineralization had changed the surface enough that some of the finer structural detail was gone. But he was certain it wasn't cattle. Wrong density for the size of the piece. Wrong proportions for horse. He'd worked on enough bodies, animal and human, that he could say what it wasn't. And what it wasn't was any farm animal Kettrick might try to talk himself into accepting as an explanation. Kettrick rode back from Redbird Crossing and went directly to the ravine. He wasn't looking to verify what Coles had told him. He already believed it. He wanted to see the scale of it. The collapsed section of the ravine wall that Drest had described to him in April was about 6 feet wide and roughly 4 feet deep at the exposed face. What Kettrick found there wasn't a deposit in the way you think of a mineral deposit, a vein running through surrounding rock, bounded, finite, following the logic of geology. It was a mass, layered and dense, partially mineralized throughout, with the denser pieces towards the bottom and lighter, more fragmentary material towards the surface where erosion had been working at it. He pressed his boot against the lower section and it didn't shift. It was large enough that it couldn't have come from one body. He wrote that plainly, without elaboration, which was his way of recording the things he didn't want to sit with too long. The site itself had been disturbed before. Not recently. Not from Drest's extraction. The surrounding material had been moved and replaced in a way that suggested deliberate placement, not a collapse, not a flood deposit, not the random accumulation of time. Someone had put things there. The arrangement wasn't natural. Kettrick was a farmer who dug foundations and cleared land for 30 years, and he knew the difference between what the earth does on its own and what it looks like when a person has been working in it. He didn't remove anything, didn't mark the site, didn't scratch an X into a tree. He walked back to Harlan's notch and wrote down everything he saw before the light failed, in the same ledger where he'd recorded the previous winter's corn yield. You're listening to the Echoes of the Hollow. We find the stories that county records tried to lose. If you're hearing this on any other channel, that content was taken without permission, and we'd appreciate you reporting it. Now let's get back to Harlan's notch, because what was happening to the people who'd used those tools was only getting worse. By the time September arrived, those patches on their skin weren't just patches anymore. Goltseri's forearms had completely locked up from his wrists all the way to his elbows. But this wasn't the kind of stiffness you feel when a muscle cramps and then eventually lets go. His arms were locked in the way something locks when the very material it's made of has been swapped out for something else entirely. When he bent his arms, the skin didn't flex or bunch up like living tissue should, but instead it moved like a heavy leather sleeve, shifting as one solid unit, without any of that small, independent give that healthy skin has. He had walked away from his job back in August, and by the middle of September, he couldn't have picked up a tool even if his life depended on it. Albert Kaus found that his hands were changing in a different way, though the process was so slow that he didn't realize how bad it was until he tried to lay his hand flat on a table. His fingers were stuck in a permanent partial curl and wouldn't straighten out, the knuckles fixed at a specific angle that had nothing to do with a hand at rest. It was the exact position a man uses to grip a chisel, almost as if his body was finishing the transformation that the tool had started months ago. Lynn Vass was the man Kettrick wrote about with the least amount of professional distance, likely because his condition was the most aggressive of the group. The patches on Lynn had reached his jaw and his cheekbone by the start of September, meaning the transformation had traveled from his palms, up his arms, across his shoulders, and onto his face in only about 3 months. Prudy had sent a second letter to her sister by then, and while that letter didn't survive the years, Kettrick mentioned it in his notes as a desperate plea that brought no help from the outside world. When he finally passed, the church record listed the cause of death as wasting sickness, a phrase that covered a lot of ground in 1864, when a clerk didn't have the right words for something he wasn't allowed to understand. During the second week of September, the village held a meeting at the church, without inviting Drest to attend. Kettrick stood before them and presented everything he'd found, from the list of names and tools to his conversation with Coles and that unsettling visit to the ravine. He didn't try to tell them how to feel, but he simply laid out the sequence of events where the material came in, the tools went out, and everyone who touched them began to change. No one in that room could come up with a better explanation, and honestly, no one tried very hard to argue against it while they watched Galt Seri sitting in a pew with his arms resting like two stones at his sides. The community reached a decision faster than usual, agreeing they had to stop using the tools, collect them from anyone who still had them, and finally go confront Drest. Kettrick recorded that confrontation in his ledger using only 3 short lines, and the brevity of those notes tells you everything you need to know about how that conversation went. Kettrick told the blacksmith exactly what the material was and what it was doing to their neighbors, and Drest just stood there and listened to the accusation. He didn't try to deny that the material was bone, and he didn't claim that the timing of the sickness was just a coincidence. According to Kettrick's notes, the only thing Drest said was that he needed to keep the forge running, and he needed something to work with. That was the only defense he offered the people of Harlan's Notch. It wasn't an accident or a lapse in judgment, but a cold decision he made because he didn't want to face a winter with a dead forge and a settlement without tools. He decided that the tools were worth the cost, and he was the one who decided that his neighbors would be the ones to pay it. The village told him to leave right then and there. Drest didn't argue or ask for time to pack, and he didn't look to anyone in the crowd for a shred of mercy. He simply loaded his mule with his remaining material and whatever finished pieces were left in the shop, and he walked out of the notch before the sun went down that day. No one followed him to see where he was going, and no one ever recorded which direction he took once he hit the main trail. But Drest leaving didn't actually stop the momentum of what he'd started. The tools were already out there in the world, held in calloused hands and worked into the skin for months, and they didn't stop being dangerous just because the man who forged them was gone. It took about 2 days for all the confiscated tools to be turned in. People brought them to Kettrick's property instead of the forge, which shows you how the community felt about that shop, and they laid them out on a canvas tarp in his yard. Hatchets, draw knives, rasps, and chisels all sat there, looking pale and wrong in the afternoon light, and you could tell that nobody wanted to be the last person left holding them. There wasn't a clear answer for what they should do with the items now that they were gathered. Someone suggested they should try burning them, so Kettrick built a fire hot enough to turn green wood to ash in minutes, and dropped 2 of the chisels right into the coals. The smell that came off that fire was so foul, it drove everyone back 10 feet. But it wasn't the acrid smell of burning bone that any country person would recognize. It was something else entirely, that felt heavy in the throat, and stayed there long after the wind should have carried it away. When they finally pulled the pieces out of the fire, the tools hadn't changed at all, but the air around them felt ruined. They never tried to burn the tools again after that. Instead, they took the canvas tarp to the eastern edge of the settlement, where the trees started, and buried the whole lot about 4 feet deep. Kettrick made sure to note the exact location in his ledger, describing the spot in relation to a specific oak tree and the bend in the creek, though he never wrote down why he felt the need to record it. He just seemed to understand that someone, someday, should probably know exactly where those things were resting. Len Vass died the following month, on October 14th, 1864. The minister who wrote the official record had seen Len in those final weeks, and since what he saw was too strange for official documents, he used the standard language of the time and called it wasting sickness. Kettrick wrote his own entry that same week, a 4-line note that avoided any medical talk or theories about what was happening. He just described what Len looked like at the very end, and it is the only place in the entire ledger where his handwriting looks shaky and unsettled. Galt Seri managed to live through it. He was 51 years old and had the kind of tough constitution you only get from 30 years of hard labor, and that strength must have counted for something in the end. However, he never worked another day in his life because the rigidity in his forearms never went away. When Kettrick went to check on him a year later, he wrote that the skin on Galt's arms had taken on the color and hardness of the material from the ravine. It was pale and waxy, and if the light hit it just right, you could see that same faint grain running through it. Seri never wanted to talk about it, and he spent most of his remaining mornings just sitting on his porch, staring at his hands. Koos was the only one who saw a partial recovery. Over the winter of 1864, the patches on his hands started to pull back from his wrists and palms, leaving behind skin that looked thin and almost see-through. The joints in his fingers loosened up enough that he could mostly flatten his hands again, and he even tried to go back to light work the following spring. His grip was never as strong as it used to be, and the letters he wrote after that year are much harder to read because his handwriting had become small and jittery. The most interesting case was the child, whose palm cleared up completely within 6 months, without leaving a single trace behind. He was the only person in Kettrick's records to make a full recovery, and it's worth thinking about why that happened. He was the one person who had the least contact with the material, the shortest amount of time holding it, and absolutely no understanding of what he was actually touching. That detail would become very important later on when Kettrick started theorizing about why some people seemed to absorb the sickness so much faster than others. 2 years after they buried the tools, a man named Ord Fitch decided to dig up one of the chisels out of pure curiosity. He handled the tool for only a few minutes before he got spooked, set it back in the hole, and covered it up with dirt again. Even that brief contact was enough, because a patch appeared on his thumb within a week, though it eventually faded once he stopped touching the thing. The tools were still exactly what they had always been, and a few feet of dirt hadn't changed their nature one bit. Spring took its time reaching eastern Kentucky in 1865, and the creek crossings were still running dangerously high when Kettrick made his way back to the ravine that April. He didn't go alone this time, bringing Hiram Coles along with a younger man named Taft Brewer, who followed a few paces behind them. Brewer was in his late 20s and strong, and they'd brought him because Coles was 56 years old, and Kettrick's knees had been giving him constant trouble since February. Neither of the older men explained to Brewer exactly what they were walking toward as they hiked through the brush. They simply told him they needed an extra pair of hands, and warned him not to touch a single thing unless he was specifically asked to do so. The ravine had changed over the winter months, in the way these places do when the cycles of freezing and thawing work at the earth. Sections of the wall that had seemed stable the previous summer had slumped and cracked, and the exposed face of the mass Kettrick first saw in August was now significantly larger. The winter weather had peeled back another 2 feet of the surrounding dirt, revealing a horizontal cross-section that Kettrick hadn't been able to see during his first visit. He stood at the edge of the slope for a long moment before he said a word. Then he stepped back to let Coles move in for a closer look. Coles worked with a slow, methodical rhythm that showed his years of experience. He used a short-handled pick for probing the material and a magnifying lens to catch the details, moving with the particular focus of a man who was used to looking at things most people would turn away from. For nearly an hour, he worked his way across the exposed face of the deposit, while Brewer sat on a rock upstream and kept his mouth shut. Kettrick stayed back and wrote. Standing in the bottom of that ravine, with creek mud coating his boots, Coles finally confirmed what they were looking at out loud. The mass was human. It wasn't just a few pieces or something they could mistake for animal remains, but a vast quantity of human bone that had mineralized to different degrees, depending on how deep it sat. The denser and older material was packed toward the bottom, while more recent fragments sat near the surface, where the erosion had been pulling them into the light for at least a season. He refused to give Kettrick a specific number of victims. In his own private notes later on, he wrote that it was more than a family, less than a battle, which is a phrase that stays vague enough to avoid precision, while being specific enough to rule out any kind of accident. This arrangement wasn't the result of a sudden collapse or a flood deposit, because the layers were far too consistent for that. The denser pieces ran across the bottom in a nearly perfect horizontal plane, and the fragments above them were sorted in a way that suggested someone had placed them there on purpose, rather than the chaotic mess you see when water or earth moves things around. There was no clothing to be found, and no artifacts left behind. There was nothing at all that would anchor this deposit to a specific time, a certain people, or a reason for being there. But as Coles examined several of the larger fragments near the middle section, he found something that changed the nature of the discovery. He found tool marks. These were cuts made by something metal and clean-edged, and they had been made before the mineralization had set in. That meant someone had been working these bones while they still had the density of fresh material, but they weren't breaking them for marrow or scoring them like a predator would. These were deliberate, geometric cuts, the kind of marks a craftsman makes when he is shaping a piece of material for a specific purpose. Coles said that last part in a quiet voice, and then he didn't say anything else for a long time. The three men climbed out of the ravine and left before the afternoon light could drop below the ridge. They never discussed reporting what they found to the law, mostly because there was no county authority functioning reliably in 1865, and no office that would have known what to do with such a discovery. Kettrick wrote the whole visit up that evening in 12 careful lines in his ledger, and Coles kept his own separate notes that wouldn't surface for decades in a completely different context. Without ever saying it plainly, they had agreed to leave the ravine alone and let it stay buried. The ravine, however, had other ideas. Callum Drest didn't just disappear into the woods. That was the part that took Kettrick a long time to fully wrap his head around. You might expect a man who had done what Drest did to the people of Harlan's Notch, who watched them change and kept his forge running anyway, to vanish into the mountains and stay gone. But Drest didn't stay hidden. He simply moved on to the next place. The first real trace of him appears in 1866 in a settlement called Wire Gap, which sat about 20 miles southeast of Harlan's Notch. This account isn't found in any official county record, but rather in the journal of a circuit preacher named Aldous Mern. Mern passed through Wire Gap twice a year and kept detailed notes on the health of the communities he visited, and his entries often included more than just church attendance if something had gone wrong enough to need documenting. His entry from the spring of 1866 describes a plague of the skin that was affecting several families in the settlement, which Mern connected to a blacksmith who had recently arrived and then departed. He described the tools the man left behind as being pale-colored and feeling wrong to the touch, and he wrote that trying to clean them with fire did nothing to the metal, but caused a great sickness in anyone who breathed the smoke. That specific detail matches exactly what the people in Harlan's Notch found when they tried to burn the chisels, and it's too precise to be a coincidence. Mern never used the blacksmith's name in his writing, He described him as a lean man of middle height, with the kind of heavy forearms you only see on someone who has spent a lifetime at a forge, which fits dressed well enough that Kettrick marked the passage when he finally read it. The people of Wyatt had burned the man's belongings and refused to tell the story to anyone outside the settlement because they didn't want to be known as the place where such a thing happened. The journal entry only exists because Myrne felt he had a duty to be a witness, even when the people involved wanted to be forgotten. The second account of Drest is more formal and much more damning. It comes from a complaint filed with a land office near the Virginia border in 1868, a document that only survived because it was attached to a long property dispute. It describes a man who arrived at a mining camp in the autumn of that year, selling tools made of worked bone. The camp operator filed the complaint after 3 of his miners developed a whitening of the skin on their hands and arms after using the tools they had purchased. The man who sold them was described as lean and in his late 40s or early 50s, with heavily calloused hands that showed no signs of whitening despite how much he handled the material. He took his payment and disappeared before anyone thought to stop him. By the time Kettrick finally read that complaint, he found a copy during a 1903 land dispute that pulled his own ledger into the public record. He had spent years thinking about the same question. He wondered if Drest had truly understood what was happening to the people of Harlan's Notch, and if the families in Wyatt or the miners near the border had ever been warned. His conclusion was written in the final pages of his ledger, in a handwriting that had grown smaller and more careful with his age. Kettrick believed Drest had known from the very beginning. His immunity to the sickness wasn't a matter of luck or a strong constitution. Whatever the bone transferred through touch and use had already run its course in Drest long before he ever brought that first load of material into Harlan's Notch. He wasn't immune to the change because he had already finished changing. The ravine that provided all that material was never reported to any county authority or official office. No record exists of it ever being surveyed, assessed, or closed off by the state. Whatever Coles and Kettrick knew, they kept hidden in documents that never reached the hands of people with the power to do anything about it. Kettrick's ledger finally ends in 1871. The very last entry isn't about Drest or the ravine at all. The final entry in the ledger of Amos Kettrick is dated March 14th, 1871, and it stands apart from the years of mundane notes about crop yields or debts. It is only 4 lines long, and instead of documenting the weather or the local economy, it describes a dream. Kettrick seems careful with that word, using it once before backing away, as if he didn't quite believe his own explanation for what he saw. In this vision, he returns to the ravine to find the exposed mass has vanished, leaving the walls smooth and clean, like a wound that has finally closed over. There was no trace of what had been there, just the creek running along the bottom and that heavy, particular quiet you only find in a hollow where nothing moves. When he woke from that dream, he found a pale, colorless patch of skin on the back of his left hand. He had never used those tools himself, and he hadn't touched the raw material since that single moment in 1864 when he brought the fragment to Coles. That was 7 years prior, a brief contact he assumed was short enough to escape whatever the material did to a man, but the mark on his hand suggested otherwise. He watched that patch fade over the next few weeks, noting its shrinking dimensions in the margins of his final entry, until the measurements simply stop, which is likely when there was nothing left to see. The record goes silent after that point, and we have no way of knowing if Kettrick stopped writing, or if the later pages were simply lost to time. It is just as possible he realized the ledger had already said everything that needed saying. leaving the rest of his life to pass in a silence the documents don't bridge. The ledger didn't surface again until 1903, 32 years later, when it was pulled into a boring land dispute over the parcel containing the ravine. It was the kind of low-stakes property argument that creates stacks of paperwork no one ever reads, used only to prove Kettrick had been on the land as far back as 1864. Whether the lawyers or the judge ever read past the crop records the parts about bone tools and what happened to Galtzery's arms is something the official record never mentions. Between 1903 and 1940, that ravine changed hands 4 times, yet no one ever built a cabin or pulled a single piece of timber from the woods. Each transfer looks clean on paper, with a price and a signature. But the documents never explain why the previous owners wanted out so badly, or what the buyers actually intended to do. They did nothing with the land, choosing instead to hold it for a time, before passing the burden to someone else. By 1962, the taxes on the parcel went unpaid, and the county land registry still lists it today as unclaimed, with no owner of record. The tools Kettrick buried at the edge of Harlan's Notch are still out there, somewhere under the forest floor, hidden near an oak tree and a creek bend that no longer serve as landmarks. The forest moved back in during the 20th century and swallowed what was left of the settlement, taking the geography of the place with it. We can't know if those tools are still 4 feet down where Kettrick left them, or if the shifting earth and the curiosity of others have moved them since the record ended. I want to know what you think about the things we leave behind, and if some materials carry a weight that can't be washed away by fire or time. Is it possible for something to move through the act of making, passing from a tool into the very hands that hold it? If you have a story about an object in your family that came with a history you couldn't explain, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. I'm also looking for those places in the mountains that people just stopped visiting without ever giving a clear reason why. Some names disappear from the record not because they were forgotten, but because the record itself decided it was safer to let them go. There is something you need to understand about what a blacksmith's forge meant to a community the size of Harlan's Notch, before you can really grasp what Drest did, or why the people around him let it happen for as long as they did. A settlement of 80 people in eastern Kentucky in 1864 did not have any safety nets built into it, and there certainly wasn't a second forge 2 miles down the road, or a traveling smith who showed up on a reliable schedule. What Callum Drest made at his forge was the physical skeleton of everything those people did to stay alive, from the hinges on their doors to the blades on the plows that broke the soil. Every horse that pulled a wagon of supplies through the war-torn countryside was wearing shoes he had hammered out, and every piece of work those people did in a day passed through his hands at some point. That is the only reason nobody stopped him in April, when he came back from 3 days in the mountains with a mule loaded down with something that didn't look or smell like iron ore. The settlement needed what he made so badly that the question of what he was making it from became a luxury they couldn't afford to ask. When your tools are broken and the supply roads have been dry for months, you take whatever works, and you save your questions for later. That isn't a sign of stupidity, but rather it is just how people survive when they are living in hard country. Drest understood that desperation because he had spent 15 years reading the needs of the settlement and responding to them. And by 1864, he knew exactly how little room his neighbors had for high principles. He brought the strange material in and lit the forge and started working before anyone even thought to ask him to stop. He was a master of his trade, and the tools he produced from that pale material were not obviously inferior to the iron they were used to. Elbert Kaus wrote a letter to his brother, describing the tools as feeling strangely light in the hand, but biting deep into the wood, which is exactly how you would describe a tool that performs far beyond what its weight suggests it should. The edges held their sharpness, and the chisels didn't chip at the first sign of hard use the way green iron often does. Whatever that material actually was, Drest had figured out how to work it into something functional. And for people who lived and died by function, that was the only argument that mattered. Nobody talked about the color much in those early days, even though the pale grayish white of the finished tools would have stood out to anyone who had spent their life around a traditional forge. Drest had his reasons ready for anyone who asked, blaming the tint on different mineral content or a specific quench temperature, and most people were too busy putting in corn or cutting timber to care. The tools were in their hands, and the tools worked, and in a place like Harlan's Notch, the season didn't hold for anyone's comfort. It was only later, after the patches had been on Koos's palms for 2 weeks, and Kettrick had started writing names in his ledger, that people began looking at those white blades with a different kind of eyes. By then the looking didn't matter, because the contact had already happened, and the damage was already done. There is one specific detail from that time at the forge that didn't make it into Kettrick's primary entries, but it appears in a marginal note near the back of the ledger in a different ink. He writes that during the weeks Drest was producing that initial run of tools, the forge fire itself ran a different color that was closer to the pale shade of the bone than the orange-white of iron work. A neighbor named Sem Brack mentioned the strange flame to Kettrick once, and then never brought it up again, which is how people often dismiss details that don't fit into the world they want to believe in. Kettrick wrote it down anyway, because he was the kind of man who recorded the things other people chose to ignore, and that is why his ledger survived, while Brack's memory faded away. The smell coming from the forge during that month was also noted briefly by Kaus in that same letter where he praised the quality of the tools. It wasn't the usual scent of hot iron and coal smoke, or the sweetness of burning flux, but something else that sat underneath the smoke and only hit you when the wind shifted at the wrong angle. He didn't describe the smell further, noting it only as wrong before moving back to the tools themselves, because the tools were the point of the letter, and the smell was just a detail he mentioned to be thorough. By the time he understood what that smell actually signified, his hands were already beginning to change. You have to consider the character of Drest himself before the story moves into what happened after he left, because who he was matters to how you read everything that follows. 15 years at a forge in an isolated hollow is a long time, and you learn the people around you the way you learn a piece of iron you have worked 1,000 times. Drest would have known exactly which families were the most desperate for tools by the spring of 1864, and he would have known whose plough had failed, or whose horse had gone unshod through the winter. He had priced his regular work fairly for over a decade, and the people of the Notch trusted him, because he had given them every reason to. That long history of trust is what made the distribution of the pale tools so fast and so complete. People took the tools because Drest was the one who made them, and he had spent 15 years earning the default assumption that whatever he produced was safe to use. He built that reputation over a decade and a half of ordinary, honest work, and then he spent every bit of that social capital in 6 weeks. When Kettrick finally confronted him and asked him to account for what he was doing, all Drest offered was the heat of the forge and the rhythm of his hammer. Whether he ever looked back in the years that followed at what he had done to the families of Harlan's Notch is a question that doesn't have an answer in any record. Kettrick clearly thought about it, and the final pages of his ledger circle the idea without ever landing on a firm conclusion. He kept coming back to the idea of immunity, wondering if Drest had already absorbed whatever the bone transferred, and was past the phase where it would show on his skin. If the change in Drest was already complete by 1864, then he hadn't just stumbled onto that ravine in April of that year. He had found something like it before, in some earlier settlement, long before he ever came over the ridge into Harlan's Notch, with his fair prices and his clean welds. He had used 15 years of unremarkable competence to make the community stop paying attention to him. And by the time Kettrick understood the situation well enough to ask the right questions, Drest was already gone. He disappeared into the mountains with his material and his tools, leaving the people he had served to deal with whatever he had become.